Our next panel is, and I'll invite them to come up as I'm introducing them, is going to talk about what we call the through line of threat, the connectivity between disparate actors, as Dina was describing, who encourage one another, even though they may not be seen to the naked eye as being involved in any kind of common group. It is a very profound threat, and one that manifested itself here through many different communities, all the way up to Buffalo and beyond. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn this over to Marc-Andre Argentino. Thank you.
Good morning again, everyone. We have assembled an all-star panel to discuss the through line of threat from Pittsburgh to Buffalo. Amarnath Amar Asingam from Queen's University will lead off by providing an historical analysis and explanation of events from Pittsburgh to Buffalo. Blythe Crawford from King's College will follow with an explanation of Chan culture and the role it played in radicalizing and mobilizing these perpetrators of violence. And Marc-Andre Argentino from Concordia University will close with lessons learned that could help with prevention and mitigation, provide some sense of how threat actors learn from each other to improve and also build a culture of terrorism, and offer some thoughts about what it might look like when it happens again. Amar, why don't you lead off?
Everyone hear me? Great. So thanks to Eradicate Hate for the invite. I always enjoy the events here. Since 2015, right-wing extremists have been involved in 267 plots or attacks, which have killed 91 people and injured many others, according to a Washington Post analysis. If we start counting earlier, Ari Perliger's data set shows that between 1990 and 2012, there were 4,420 incidents perpetrated by right-wing extremists, killing 670 and injuring over 3,000. Since 2015, the number of these attacks and plots have steadily increased year after year. If these numbers sound surprising, it's because there are many attacks and plots which simply do not register on our radar. We remember the high casualty events like Oklahoma City, Norway, Christchurch, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, but there are daily points of trauma that are often missed, even by researchers, journalists, and activists who track this for a living. Victims remember, though. As Kenneth Robinson, pastor of Briar Creek Road Baptist Church, put it, trauma is a way of life for us. The victims of these attacks have been varied, from members of the Black community, the Jewish community, women, Muslims, immigrants and refugees, LGBTQ individuals, Asians, and other people of color, as well as religious institutions like mosques, synagogues, gurdwaras, and Black churches. The victims are diverse, but the attackers are diverse also. White supremacist, anti-minority, anti-government, to name a few, even if there's often an overlap. And I'll come back to that overlap in a second. Thinking about this presentation over the last few weeks, it's not always easy to know where to start this story, where to start talking about this so-called through line. As Cynthia Miller-Idris and others have noted, white supremacy is foundational to the United States, from the genocide of Native Americans to the institution of slavery. As this foundation was threatened, or perceived to be threatened, movements and groups have arisen to fight for its very survival. We all know that the KKK was founded at the end of slavery and proceeded to launch a campaign of terror against freed blacks. Another place at which to start the story is perhaps after the Vietnam War, when disgruntled veterans, as Kathleen Ballou has shown, decided to take up arms against their own government in defense of white America. Much of this anti-government sentiment culminated in Oklahoma City and Ruby Ridge. But perhaps the best place to start the story of how all this is playing out today is with the election of Barack Obama. Many of the far-right sentiments that had gone underground, simmering quietly, burst into the open. New hate groups and new militia groups started mobilizing. The Tea Party mainstreamed anti-government and anti-immigrant sentiment and was now helped along by the rise of social media platforms. Individuals were easily able to create online communities with like-minded individuals hundreds of miles away. Then the attacks started going up. a shooting at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in 2009, a tragic shooting at the Wisconsin Gurdwara which killed 8 in 2012, the killing of 3 Jews at the Overland Park Community Center by a former Klansman in 2014, and the gut-wrenching killing of 9 churchgoers in Charleston in 2015. Dylan Roof, the Charleston shooter, left behind a manifesto in which he talks about his own radicalization. As he says, "The event that truly awakened me was the Trayvon Martin case. He started researching what happened and didn't see what all the fuss was about. Zimmerman," he says, "was obviously justified in his actions." From here, Roof does something quite common with most other attackers. They look to Europe. "As an American," he writes, "we are taught to accept living in the melting pot, but Europe is the homeland of white people, and in many ways the situation is even worse there," end quote. This notion of loss, of erosion, of cultural replacement, of racial pollution is a common theme in all these manifestos. In order to make these arguments, attackers often make use of pseudoscientific race theories. They quote random websites talking about IQ differences and crime rates. They paint a story of demographic panic, a kind of emergency situation for white people and white culture that needs immediate attention. As the late Michael Jerryson noted in his discussion of the so-called emergency mindset, emergencies are scenarios when normal kinds of behavior can legitimately be set aside. When an individual is driving in a car, they may normally not speed or run red lights, but if they are transporting someone who is injured or about to give birth, then the normal rules no longer apply. For Jerryson, if the emergency is not localized in a person or place, but rather a worldwide emergency, it impacts more than one type of behavior. It realigns a person's worldview. When individuals come to adopt an emergency mindset, nuances are lost, and we start to feel like we're involved in a cosmic war of good and evil. That is one of the through lines. Most attackers don't leave manifestos, of course, but there are usually clues elsewhere. On October 27, 2018, Robert Bowers walked into the Tree of Life Synagogue here in Pittsburgh and opened fire, killing 11 and injuring 7. Before the shooting, he had posted on the alt-tech platform Gab that the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society was helping to bring in immigrants into the United States. Bowers was swimming deep in age-old conspiracies that Jews were ultimately trying to kill off the white race, and they were weaponizing immigration to change the cultural and demographic makeup of the majority white nations. Bowers may not have left a manifesto, but his is an interesting case study into lone actor violence, which characterizes most far-right attacks we see today. This does not mean, of course, that they aren't swimming in a broader movement, absorbing ideologies and grievances. Much like how a solar flare is an intense, localized eruption that bursts out of the sun's atmosphere, attackers like Bowers also burst out of a broader ecosystem of hate. They are not lone thinkers and feelers, even if they are lone actors. That is another important through line. Thus far, I've spoken about attacks in the US, but in order to understand some of the more recent attacks and this emergency mindset, a broader far-right context is necessary. Some of the disturbing trends we are currently seeing, namely posting a manifesto prior to an attack, structuring the manifesto in a kind of question and answer format, live streaming the attack itself, decorating one's weapon with significant dates in Western history, past attackers and ideologies, all trace back to the 2011 attack by Anders Behring Breivik in Norway and the 2019 Christchurch attack. It's not an accident that they look similar. These two attackers, in the words of scholars like Ralph Larkin and Graham Macklin, provide a, quote, cultural script for subsequent attackers. Breivik inspired Tarrant, and Tarrant was a kind of saint for John Earnest, the 2019 Poway synagogue attacker, Patrick Crusius, the 2019 El Paso shooter, as well as the Buffalo shooter. Crusius begins his manifesto with the words, "In general, I support the Christchurch shooter and his manifesto," and goes on to rail against race mixing and so-called Hispanic invasion of America. John Earnest, like Robert Bowers, blames the Jewish community for masterminding the destruction of the white race. As he writes, quote, "Every Jew is responsible for the meticulously planned genocide of the European race." Peyton Gendron, the Buffalo attacker, goes even further. According to our analysis, 67% of his manifesto is a direct copy and paste of Tarrant's manifesto. As he writes, "I stole lots of information from Tarrant because I can't say it any better," end quote. The Buffalo attacker's manifesto also points to what we've called a kind of Wikipedia effect, each attacker building on other attackers, avoiding their mistakes, and building on their successes. Another significant through line. From Gendron's perspective, the ideological foundation for future attacks had already been perfected by Tarrant. It's already been canonized, if you will. Where Gendron felt that he could contribute was with tactical advice, and he does this ad nauseum. dedicating hundreds of pages of his manifesto and Discord diary to outlining the mechanics of the attack, from preparing his automatic weapon, the helmet he chose, his diet and exercise regimen, all the way down to the best socks to wear during a mass shooting. This is the kind of banality of evil we've come to expect. Not only that, but contributing to this broader tapestry of attacks, this wiki effect I was mentioning, gives their individual involvement an elevated sense of meaning and purpose. They are not merely copycats, but heroes engaged in a cosmic battle during a pivotal historical moment. They are frontline workers in a state of emergency. All this is to not even mention the random acts of individual killings that have occurred, the murders of Craig Anderson, Timothy Kaufman, Blaise Bernstein, and others. I've limited my talk here to the overt attacks we've seen in the United States, just to keep it simple, but as we factor in disinformation, conspiracy theories, the electoral success of certain far-right viewpoints and individuals, and as we factor in trends in Canada and Europe, the picture only grows more complicated and concerning. As such, and unfortunately, we may see more of these so-called solar flares burst out of this ecosystem of hate in the coming months and years. Thank you.
Thank you. Blythe?
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone from Eradicate Hate for having us here. It's great to be able to speak about these issues in such a room full of great people. So as Amar has been saying, we're really not looking at Buffalo as an isolated incident. We're seeing this as something that's part of this broader trend of kind of race hate in the US and beyond, and as part of a kind of spring or spree of violence that we've seen kind of coming from an online milieu. And it's this kind of milieu that I'll speak a little bit more about, which provides these attacks with a cultural script, as Amar was saying. So we've seen a particular kind of through line with these attacks of online forums being particularly central to these attackers and being mentioned repeatedly as sites where they've been radicalized online that are very important to why the attacks look the way they do and why, to some extent, they keep happening. In particular, we see Chan sites like 4chan and 8chan being repeatedly mentioned and repeatedly gaining some significance for these attackers. For instance, in the Buffalo shooter's primary materials, he mentions 4chan 21 times throughout the pages of his materials. He also mentions several other Chan sites that he wants to post to and that other users can go on and have a look at essentially online. So it's worth kind of delving into these sites a little bit and understanding why these attacks look the way they do. Unlike other kind of far-right forums, Chan sites are a little bit individual in that they're not inherently far-right spaces. They didn't start as far-right spaces, and not all kind of corners of the online realm that they feel are inherently extremist. We see kind of boards that are just set up for general interest discussions or for people to kind of explore their identities online, and it's really only certain pockets of these sites that are dedicated fully to far-right extremism. So while very significant, they're not kind of the whole picture of these sites online. And this is really in contrast to forums like Iron March and Stormfront that are entirely dedicated to far-right extremism and are very overt in their embrace of kind of neo-Nazism. Chan sites, in contrast, they arose from really a deeply kind of internet-centric circle. We saw Chans coming up from like this dual influence of kind of online Japanese culture in the early 2000s and kind of Western online internet culture from very specific comedic forums that kind of imbued the initial stages of Chan sites with this real hostility and kind of inward self-loathing rather than, a real focus on far-right extremism. So there are several features of Chan sites that are really important to understanding why they have such a draw for extremists, even though they're not inherently far-right spaces. The first is kind of to do with technological design of these spaces. They are almost completely anonymous spaces, in contrast to mainstream social media like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You're not going on these sites kind of to post your name, to talk about your life, and to kind of share your real-world experiences. You're here anonymously, and there are some sort of effects of that where, more extreme speech will take place because of that. Things are not archived in these spaces technologically. If you post something and it's not engaging enough, if people aren't interacting with it enough, that thing's taken down and lost forever unless it's manually archived. So these are really different spaces from mainstream social media. Similarly, they're not moderated the way that mainstream social media is. We see in-house moderation where groups of users will come together. And really, they want to moderate these spaces in a way that is fun for them, essentially. So rather than taking down posts about extremism or in some cases, gore or racism, these things might be left up, whereas if you say something really boring, maybe that'll get taken down, So they're really moderated in a very different way that focuses on user experience rather than kind of strict guidelines that we'd see on more mainstream social media. And these things kind of lead to a very specific online culture on these sites. Because they're open spaces, there are no kind of passwords or usernames, anyone can take part in these sites. We see a real emphasis on kind of social and cultural policing, where there's a real emphasis on social norms. So users are extremely hostile to each other and to outsiders. There's a real emphasis on using slurs, kind of racial slurs and slurs against all kinds of minorities, all over the place just to keep people out. If they can't handle it, they're not allowed to kind of partake in these spaces. Potentially posting gore and shocking incidents and celebrating violence very openly as a way to keep people who are upset by this and who have a sense of empathy that they want to express out of these spaces. There's a real emphasis on keeping these places extremely hostile. And I think kind of the main thing to understand about these spaces is their allegiance to counterculture, all the way through from their kind of inception. 4chan was founded in 2003, and today there's an emphasis on counterculture, going against the mainstream, maybe just doing something. You might not even feel kind of politically motivated, but you might just kind of want to upset the normies or upset the mainstream. So we see an emphasis on trolling and kind of running online campaigns against kind of minorities, specifically just to upset people who don't understand what's really going on. And it's from this kind of countercultural perspective that we can begin to understand the politics of these spaces. When they started, there was maybe not such an open and earnest embrace of sort of neo-Nazism and fascism, and it was more sort of adopting, racial slurs or white supremacist insignia for the purposes of humor and irony. And it's only throughout the years that this, ironic, potentially, embrace of racism and racial hatred has become a lot more earnest. And we saw this shift take place around 2014 during Gamergate, which I will not sum up for you because it's 9 a.m. in the morning, so don't worry about that. But essentially this was an intensely misogynistic online campaign that saw the fracturing of 4chan bleeding into 8chan, which became a lot more popular. And it's at this point in history that we saw the real intensification of irony turn towards more earnest embrace of extremism. And it's really from this milieu that we saw a spree of mass shootings and mass violence emanating from. So we saw this really starting in earnest in 2019, not disregarding past mass shootings in 2015 that have emanated from 4chan. But we saw with the Christchurch shooting, this was the first time that these chan sites were really foregrounded by an attacker. We saw the Christchurch shooter posting to 8chan prior to his attack, saying that the people on 8chan were, in his words, the best bunch of cobbers he could have asked for, and really expressing his dedication to this community. We saw throughout his manifesto there were mimetic references to elements of Chan culture. We saw a real emphasis on counterculture and including things in his manifesto that would be misunderstood by a mainstream audience, essentially kind of including a trolling campaign in his mass shooting. The live stream, as Amar was saying, was kind of tailored to be essentially going viral within this online space. And we've seen this kind of replicated and emulated by each shooter that has arisen from this cultural milieu, including the Buffalo shooter. As Amar was saying, we saw the Buffalo shooter taking a lot of the primary materials created by the Christchurch shooter and kind of bundling them into his manifesto and his Discord logs. So these attacks are essentially made to be amicable. They're made to go viral, and they're made to elevate people within this incredibly hostile online space to sainthood status. Once an attack has been taken place, the violence is celebrated, and you're essentially kind of enshrined as a hero within this online space. So you can engage in this community, you can find your people online, and then you can trade it all in to become a saint, essentially. And this is potentially something that we saw happening with the Buffalo shooter. Just briefly before I hand over to Marc-Andre, I think it's worth talking about where Chan sites are now. I want to kind of repeat, that these are not inherently extremist spaces still, but we do see a real emphasis on some extremist spaces at the moment, even though 8chan is now out of the picture. There's a real emphasis now on kind of smaller Chan sites, particularly those on the dark web, where people are essentially leaving behind a lot of the irony nowadays and are openly adopting accelerationism and neo-Nazi beliefs in earnest. They'll be sharing PDFs, be they ideological or encouraging each other to prepare attacks and how to get weapons. But we also see a renewed kind of focus on 4chan. We've seen 2 shootings very recently referencing 4chan as, particularly an important online space for online attackers. So I think that although it might sound to those of you who this is an introduction to online forums and to Chan culture, it might sound a little stupid, essentially, that we're talking about internet culture and memes and this sort of thing, but we are seeing these online spaces repeatedly be very important to mass shooters. So I think it's something that we need to keep watching out for and kind of keep an eye on, essentially. And with that, I'll hand over to Marc-Andre.
Thank you, Blythe. Marc-Andre.
So now I have the pleasant job of talking about what's going to happen next. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for having us here. As Amar said, we're talking about a wiki effect. We're talking about a cultural script. What this means is not only the ideological dissemination from attacker to attacker, but they're also sharing their tactics, their techniques, and their procedures on how to become better killers. Part of it is you want to be better than those that came before you. In the case of the recent Buffalo shooting, the attack was, in a way, an ode to the Christchurch shooter. He wanted to have the attack on the same day as the Christchurch shooter. He was trying to emulate and simulate everything that he did. We've seen other attackers do the same thing, following in the steps of those that came before them. What they're doing time and time again is improving themselves as they go forward, trying to be more creative, more deadly, and also avoid and detection. As much as we put the work as practitioners and experts in the field to better understand these individuals and the threats and what's going to come next, they also learn from each other to improve and to make sure that we cannot catch them. This is a challenge in this space when it comes to what's going to happen next. There is so much possibility to what's going to come down, and it doesn't need to be sophisticated. Some things that we can highlight is, from a let's say, kinetic perspective, is live streaming. If we look at the role that it played, especially in the most recent shooting in Buffalo, the attacker himself said that live streaming was an important factor to his radicalization process, because if he wasn't able to find that video on Chan sites, he would likely not have been radicalized. He would not have been motivated to do what he did. So there is an important element of that, because it gives to some of them in the space an element of credibility. When he was talking about the Charleston shooter, he had said that though his attack was a success, because it was not live streamed, it failed. It did not have the after effect that is needed for this space to save the white race from its replacement. So part of it is the propaganda element. How do you get the message out so that you have others that will follow in your footsteps and continue this? That's one thing that we're going to need to watch out for, and it's something that's difficult, especially looking at those spaces that's happened, as Blythe was saying. If a non-observer would go onto a Chan site, someone who's not familiar with this, if you're worried about a child or a friend and you go on the platforms they go to, some of it might seem weird, some of it might seem extremely terrible, but it's hard to differentiate between, is this person a potential attacker, or is this person just interested in this space, interested in internet culture? A lot of us in this field kind of grew up in that space, and we did not end up on the receiving end or on the other side of this conversation. So it's trying to understand what is the difference between those of us who can navigate these space without committing any harms versus those that will radicalize and commit attacks. The other lesson learned that's going to come up is the improvement of the attacks over time. And this is where the concern comes, as they learn to get better at killing. One of the things that they've learned over time is reconnaissance. You saw early with the Christchurch shooter that he used a drone to get a better idea of the layout of the mosque that he was going to do his attack, to get an idea of what was going on in the space. Well, we've seen the Buffalo shooter do the same thing, where he went 3 times to the supermarket to draw maps of the space, to count how many African Americans were at the supermarket at different times to get the maximum possible kill count. He did research on population densities based on how many African Americans are living in an area to make sure that he had the best possible targets. And it was based on his research that he chose where to go. Reading his manifesto, he chose, oh, maybe I'll shoot a synagogue. Maybe I'll go to a school. Maybe I'll go to a church. The possibilities were there, but it's based on the research and the preparation that he did, that he was able to come forward and make that decision. The other thing that they're doing when it comes to learning and evolving is improving based on what others have done before them. I hate to give these guys direct quotes, but I am going to have to read one passage from what he was saying. He basically was talking about how to test your equipment to make sure that they work properly. Talking about how John Ernest had a jam in his gun that prevented him from killing more people. Talked about how Stéphane Balliette's gun did not work properly. Talked about how Brendan Tarrant himself had a failure to extract. All of that learning, what happened was the days before he was planning his attack in Buffalo, his gun jammed when he was at his home. And he postponed his attack until he was able to fix that issue. The fact that he was actually learning from those before him guaranteed the success of this attack for him. The same thing happened with his live streaming. He dedicates a huge part of his documents talking about how he tested his live stream capacity. Oh, I'm going to try on Facebook in the way that the Christchurch shooter did. It's a platform for boomers. Maybe I won't get the audience I want. All right, let's try it on Twitch and Discord, the gaming platforms he was familiar with. And he tried and tried again up until he was able to successfully achieve his live streaming. That required him to get a new phone, upgrade his data plan. All of this preparation was put in to have the maximum effect. And he ends his manifesto with a statement for those who come after him. And it's about, I need you guys to take a deep analysis of all my mistakes I made and how to fix them. He wants those who come after him to read the manifesto and his diaries, to learn from his mistakes. He leaves behind a manual on how to buy your armor, how to improve on what he did, how to get your weapons, how to get your ammunition, how to do your reconnaissance, so that the next person after him will improve. And for those of you who think that reading 852 pages or 1,000 pages from the Norway shooter or 100 pages from other shooters is something that most people won't do, you're wrong. These individuals pore over these texts and they read and they learn. As much as we're trying to improve our prevention and our mitigation measures, they are also improving. And this is the challenge and the lesson learned for us is we need to keep an eye out and get a better understanding of where they're going to go next. And we're never going to get ahead because there's always going to get a different tactic, but it's to get an idea of how can we reduce the population pool that is willing to commit these attacks. And after the fact is what can we do to support the communities so that the damage that they've done is as minimal as possible so that they don't have the success that they need. Down the line, are we going to continue seeing these attacks? Sadly, for now, it's very likely we're going to see more. So it comes down to how do we make ourselves resilient to these attacks and how do we get a better understanding of detecting potential mass shooters and mass killers. And it's those signs that are going to be difficult to find out. I know that Laura wanted us to give an objective and a goal or something for us to seek and try to find out. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to start looking at these individuals as a larger culture and a larger community. Even though they are lone attackers, as Amar was saying, there is a culture of mass shooters within the space where they are worshiping, egging each other on, and learning from each other. And we can't just look as single incidents, but there is a through line that connects all of these attacks and these incidents together. And it's not only the ones that happen in North America, but there's a connection to Europe as well. As much as we might focus within attacks that have happened in the US at this event, it's important to keep in mind that as much as we are international in the practitioners and the experts that are here, so are the extremists that are willing to do these attacks, and they are connected and talking to each other across the borders. And that's something we need to break down these barriers to make sure that we work together collaboratively on this issue.
Well, on that sobering note, all three of our panelists are going to be with us. If you want to continue the conversation, grab them. I know they're very willing to talk. And I want to thank all three of you for these thought-provoking presentations this morning. Thanks.